Thank you so much for having me. Hello, I'm Mark Meer. I'll be your sub for today. My name is Mark Meer. I do voices in video games, and I guess the one that I'm best known for, or rather the three that I'm best known for, are the Mass Effect trilogy, where I play Commander Shepard and a bunch of aliens. I also do a lot of RPGs, and over the last 18 months, considerably more than usual, including some streaming shows like The Black Dice Society, which is DM'd by Mr. B. Dave Walters. Yes, and you can watch that on the official Dungeons and Dragons Twitch and YouTube channels every Thursday at 4 p.m. Pacific.
Yes. Once again, I think for about the first 10 seconds or so there, I was muted. So, when I gave away the nuclear launch codes there, they couldn't even hear me. So that's, guess it wasn't meant to be. Yes, Black Dice Society. Let's just jump right into this. Before we get started, if you have any questions for Mark or myself about all things TTRPG, and yes, I see the frantic chat can't hear you written all in caps in my note over here. I was like, I don't think they can hear me. Turns out you couldn't hear me. If you have any questions, put them in chat with a capital question in front of it. So if you have questions for Mark, for me, about game stuff in general, anything in particular, if you want to get down in the weeds and the minutia, we can do that. Just put capital question in front of it. They're going to pull it out. I got my sheet over here, and we'll get down in it. Capital question in front of it. They're going to pull it out. Hold on. My sheet.
There we are. Sorry about that.
I'm like, hey, I know that old boy.
Yeah. That's my good friend, B. Dave Walters.
Hey. Let's talk a little bit about the Black Dice Society. For people who don't know, it is our official Ravenloft actual play stream. This is us. This is the art that is behind him right now. So it's Artception there of it, yeah. And there you. That's a you. It's Brother Uriah.
Yeah.
It is a horror stream. It's an official Ravenloft stream. And I've told this story many times that when WotC hit me up about this show, and they asked me who I wanted on the cast, I knew immediately. You were literally my first call. I got off the phone with WotC and called you first. How did you get into Ravenloft originally?
I got into it with the original module, I6, I believe, way back when. And Ravenloft really does appeal to my sensibilities. Here I am wearing an American Werewolf in London t-shirt and sitting in a room that you can't see that has a bunch of horror toys in it. But yes, I'm a big Halloween and horror fan and was a Dungeons and Dragons player. And so that first module was just, the Reese peanut butter cup of gaming to me. It was a perfect blend of everything that I liked. And I stuck with Ravenloft, buying all the supplemental material as it came out. I really got into it around third edition when all the gazetteers were coming. I guess it would be 3 going into 3.5. So Ravenloft has always been my favorite setting. Not my first setting that I ever played, but definitely became my favorite. And, I always kept my ear to the ground whenever any new Ravenloft stuff came out. So when Curse of Strahd hit the shelves, of course, I immediately snapped that up. And that was great, but it was just Barovia. And Barovia is the OG of domains and Strahd is the OG of big bads. But in my Ravenloft stuff, I'd always sort of explored the other domains because Strahd was sort of like well-worn territory that will be in the background of the campaign. But I really got into exploring Darkon, which is why I am so very gratified that B-Dave very kindly allowed me to not only play Brother Uriah, a native of Darkon in the Black Dice Society, but to also play one of the NPC antagonists or possible allies, Aslan Rex, the Arch-Lich King of Darkon. So to actually get to do full prosthetics and costume and play Aslan on the stream has been the culmination of all my childhood dreams, really.
Couple things. Way back when we did D&D in a castle together in the before times, which I guess was 2019? 2019.
Yes, when it was possible to gather in castles in the United Kingdom. We're flying there from all over the world,
I reject linear time and all the other lies of the before times. I think that was the first time I saw you do your full Lich regalia because we
Mhm.
did a Barovian ball there, and you were a Darkonian diplomat, if I recall.
Yes, I wasn't actually Aslan Rex, although I'll level with you. I'm using the same silicone mask for him. But I was actually playing Ambassador Golgotha, who was a representative of Aslan, and our players in that game were all agents of the Kargat, which is essentially Aslan's secret police and enforcers. So we had a mix of human characters. They were all low-ranking Kargat members because, of course, the upper echelons are filled with lycanthropes and undead. And so it was a very interesting thing to see, especially neutral or even good characters, because they've been raised in Darkon, and that's the government. So just try to negotiate fulfilling the needs of the government mission they've been sent on, and also staying true to themselves. And it was really a fun campaign, and getting to do it in a castle. Come on, that was. I mean, you know how awesome that is.
It was incredible. Hey, we're gonna do it again next year. So there you go. If you want a chance to come and play with me or Mark, check out D&D in a Castle there. I want to dig into this a little bit because it's one of the things that I enjoy doing on Demiplanar is we kind of can get past the surface on some of this stuff. For people who aren't familiar with Ravenloft, and yes, you can watch the Black Dice Society. We got a bunch of episodes up on VOD now. That might only know about Barovia. If you had to give the elevator pitch, especially for someone who loves this, how would you describe Ravenloft and describe the domains of what it really is?
Okay, big picture, and there'll be some spoilers involved here. But Ravenloft is essentially an interdimensional prison for all the worst people and the worst supernatural beings. And of course, they all seem to follow a similar theme. So you might have one domain, Barovia, that is ruled by a vampire. You might have another domain that's ruled by a lycanthrope. You might have another that's ruled by an ancient mummy lord. And you see where we're going with this. There's a flesh golem domain, for example. But it's not just going through the list of universal monsters. It's any aspect of horror can be embodied by a domain and its Dark Lord in Ravenloft. So if there's any facet of that genre that you really want to explore, you can probably find a pre-existing domain that fits that, or create your own, which is always the fun of it. And I really like what they've done with Van Richten's guide in so far as laying out guidelines for building your domain, and also the greater campaign. They've given a lot of flexibility for what you want to do with it. There we are. Mine's not an easy reach, but the main point is that it is horror embodied, and that's an aspect of gaming that people really enjoy. I mean, look at the success of horror games like Call of Cthulhu and whatnot. Sometimes you don't necessarily want to be the conquering hero. Sometimes it's fun to be up against odds which are overwhelming, and to play that and how it affects your characters.
It is interesting because in previous editions of Ravenloft, not unlike Call of Cthulhu, there was this this madness component. This
Yeah,
idea.
fear checks, as I recall,
Yes.
and yes, horror checks.
This idea that you can't trust your senses, that that in and of itself is a horrifying thing. And I notice over time games have become more sensitive in their portrayals of things like mental illness, rightfully so. Obviously in things like Vampire, which you and I have done a little bit of together, which we'll also talk about. Things like the portrayal of the Malkavian clan have altered significantly over time, going from the fish malk woohoo to they just see things differently. Now in Ravenloft, this idea of losing your mind is less of it, but I still like the way that it just plays with the idea, again, that you can't trust what you see and you can't trust what you hear. Because if you think about it, that is innately terrifying. You and I have talked about the fact that in many ways, even though horror can be difficult to do in a story, which I may ask you something here in a second about that, Ravenloft in particular are some of the easiest stories to tell, because it's like, guess what? You went to sleep and you're here now. Guess what? Miss Roll in. Here we are, because it will come to you.
Yes, it's easy to integrate it into a campaign just because of the nature of the mists and, of course, the dark powers that remain nebulous. And, in your campaign, you could define them more if you wanted to, but they can basically do what they want. They can reach into Greyhawk, they can reach into the Forgotten Realms
Mm-hmm.
and bring a party of characters into Ravenloft. And of course, usually the typical Ravenloft game is usually you get drawn into Ravenloft and you have some adventures there and you're trying to escape and get back home. One of the things I did with my D&D in a Castle campaign was to have the entire party be native-born Ravenlofters, but specifically Darkonians, and their entire, it was a multi-planar sort of adventure that actually tied into some of the other games that were running at D&D in a Castle.
Mm-hmm.
But their whole objective was, we've got to get back to that horrible place that we come from, and
Home,
and,
no place like home, right?
yeah, and some of them, particularly, the ones that were more aligned with Azel and Rex's objectives, were just like, oh, what is this place? It's so normal here. So, yeah, it's always fun to play with those tropes.
How, I'm going to ask a two-pointed question here. How do you define horror, just as a genre?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you define horror specifically as applied to the TTRPG space?
Well, horror as a genre, I tend to lean towards the more supernatural horror, but of course, there is horror in the mundane as well. I'd say it's anything that speaks to what truly makes you afraid. And the value of horror is that it can be very cathartic. If in a controlled environment, like say watching a horror movie or playing a horror RPG, you can confront some of the things that would creep you out or make you scared. That it can be very therapeutic in a sense. So yeah, as a genre, scary. And as in an RPG space, definitely a very valuable tool and a fun thing, because it's fun to go to haunted houses, it's fun to go on roller coasters, and I don't want to fall from a great height, but on a roller coaster I can experience the feeling of falling from a great height in a controlled environment.
No, that makes
Hopefully controlled. Depends on
controlled. Hey, it could be
yeah.
a mine cart going into a dragon's mouth, though.
Which is very true. I love that. We'll get to that when we talk more about Black Side. Yeah.
We got just a ton of great questions coming in, and I'd kind of intended to wait till the end, which, by the way, if you have questions for either of us, put it in chat with a capital question in front of it. But a lot of the questions that are coming in are either exactly things that I kind of wanted to ask you or just sort of weave into some of the things. So I'm just going to jump in, and I'm going to take a couple of these now. Ardent Audio, friend to the show, Ardent Audio.
Yes.
Artist extraordinaire, Ardent Audio said, what's the difference or exciting about playing or GMing horror as opposed to other genres of games?
Well, for me personally, I like the spooky stuff. So it's just like, I get to play around with some of my favorite toys, essentially. In general, I would say that crafting a good horror story is very, very satisfying. I do a lot of improv. It's mostly comedy improv, and sometimes we do other genres, but usually with a comedic bent. But there's a show some friends of mine do called The Society of Strange. They're from the UK. They're brilliant, brilliant people. And I've got to guest with them on a number of occasions. And they will improvise entire Lovecraftian tales or an entire weird tale by, Bierce or any of the classic horror writers. And they'll do it to a T. And when they're performing, they're not going for laughs. There'll be nervous laughs throughout the audience constantly. But the satisfaction of actually, putting a bit of a chill into an audience is hard to match.
I agree with you. It's funny because I'm lucky to know a few people in the horror TTRPG space. I'm not gonna bust anybody out, and a lot of us that are doing it, horror is not necessarily their favorite thing, not necessarily innately. For me, it's a tool in the toolbox because I think all things being equal, I like very grand, very epic stories. I like, the fate of the world or the fate of many worlds. rests on the shoulders of the heroes and their actions and their inactions. And you can have horror at scale, but I feel horror by definition is intimate. You know, the bigger something gets, the less frightening it is. The single claw dragging down the wall just outside your cabin is innately more frightening than looking out and seeing the oncoming rushing zombie hordes of millions.
Mhm.
You know, and it is interesting in that to your previous point, you can explore some things in that genre that I feel you don't get in others. Like I ran Patreon games for a long time. At the height, I was running about 35 or 40 games a month. I've run about 600 games of Vampire V5. I've run more V5 than anyone else alive. And what ended up happening in those longer form games was what we found was people started to face and deal with real deep-seated personal traumas that they had in a way that none of us expected. That shy people started to open up. People that had commitment issues or all sort of unresolved baggage and issues and trauma with the past. Once we'd established a place where everyone felt safe enough, because safety is the most important thing in horror, because you have to be able to, open yourself, essentially.
Mhm.
Things started revealing themselves that they themselves didn't know. And once they started to kind of face it and process it, were able to move through it. And I haven't experienced that in any other genre of storytelling. You can do something fun, you can do something comedic, you can have a good laugh and feel better afterwards. And that is, of course, very important. But I don't know that I have seen healing emerge from anything in the way I've seen it come out of horror storytelling.
I think that's because if you think about horror as a genre, whether, say a horror movie, um, horror movies are unique in that the protagonist tends to be vulnerable. Even if, say, even if they are trained soldiers like in Aliens or whatnot, which is a bit of a sci-fi horror. And the thing is that when you're playing characters within that, you are by definition allowing yourself to be vulnerable because it's a horror story. And so I think that probably lends itself to people opening up more.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I've played, at this point, I've been blessed to play a little of almost everything. And have you played any Tin Candles?
Yes. Yeah. I played it at Gen Con at like a hotel room game, and it was fantastic. It was very, very good.
You and I did Dread with Bonnie Gordon and Ivan Van Norman, where it was a dark Three Little Pigs thing, which you should watch. I'm terrible at multitasking, or I would put the link here in chat. Maybe at some point I'll try to. I've tweeted it a bunch of times. You should watch the Gen Con game of Dread with me and Mark and Bonnie and Ivan. It was incredible. And I'm going to come back to Dread in a second because we're talking about Tin Candles. I guess I'll make both points here before I forget them. I have done Tin Candles, and for those of you that don't know, Tin Candles is a game where everyone dies. You know in advance. When you sit down at the table, you are not going to make it. And the story becomes more about how do you arrive there and how do things unfold. And ostensibly, the theory is that, divorced from trying to win, you can be more authentic in your choices and in your performance. Personally, that's not my thing at all, man. I feel like Tin Candles would be a far more compelling game if one person survived. Because what ended up happening when we were playing that game of Dread, and again, for people that don't know, Dread is still horror suspense, but you play with a Jenga tower. You don't have any dice or anything. And at dramatically appropriate moments, your guide makes you make a pull from the Jenga tower. And if the tower collapses, your character dies. That's it. I have never seen a more ingenious system for tension than that freaking tower. Because, man, when we were there at Gen Con, so they had the big tower, and the lights go down and it lights up and it's just looming. And I just remember thinking like, oh, okay, okay. And very quickly into that game, I realized what I was afraid of was not me knocking the tower over when I was making my pulls, but me making my pulls was making it harder for you guys. So then you start playing like 2 or 3 moves ahead. You know what I mean? Like, how can I get through this and make sure they get through this? And I have never experienced that in anything like I did with Dread.
Yeah, that element of tension was palpable. That was excellent. And hilariously, we're playing the Three Little Pigs. Like that's yeah, so tense, so very tense. Yeah. Although now we were talking about 10 Candles, and like I liked it because of that aspect of like everybody dies. You're not going to make it through this. I think that even more than most role-playing games, that's really collective storytelling, because you're not playing a game because it's like you're not trying to win because there's no winning. Everybody dies. And even the last person to die, it's just like, well, they'll just get to experience more horrific things before they die. Mm-hmm. So it really just puts you in the frame of mind of like everything that I'm trying to do here is going to be in the service of building this narrative. And we all want a cool narrative at the end. So everybody's just trying to make that happen. But again, I loved Dread, and that Jenga tower mechanic was amazing.
Yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't say out loud that I think for me the definition of horror is tension. That is why, and we talked about this last week with Anjali. Humor has a very interesting place in horror, because as you well know, when we started the Black Dice Society, I very much was like, this is not going to be the That's What She Said game. This is not going to be the Yucka Yucka Yuck game, because humor reduces tension. That's the purpose of it. That's why you tell jokes when you're nervous. When you're trying to build tension, have someone cut that is bad. But the human nervous system can only stay in an elevated emotional state for about 20 to 35 minutes. You can't laugh nonstop. You can't cry nonstop. So you have to wave it up and down a little. You have to have light moments, if only to plunge. You have to have low moments, if only to pay off the major gag. In how, especially given your improv training, how do you pace that? Because you're fantastic at it. You're a master at it. How do you pace those moments where you're like, now's when I need to hit the gag, because when everybody lowers their defenses, bang, I'm going to come, with the tearjerker?
I think it's, I'd credit my experience doing for many, many years an improv soap opera called Dynasty. We do it here in Edmonton. We've done it over in England. And it's an improv comedy soap opera, a parody of a soap opera, essentially. But like a soap opera, you're playing moments of drama as well. And people get really invested, especially because, like an RPG, we're doing it week to week with a continuing narrative. So the audience would really invest in that. And I think it's just all the time I've spent feeling that out and knowing, okay, now is the time for a joke. Now let's really pursue this narrative thread or this dramatic thread. So yes, I credit Dynasty.
Another question, because we've gotten several. And again, if you have questions, just put it in chat with a capital question in front of it. And I have my list over here, because this very much goes into the next thing I wanted to talk about. It's from Catch23, again, friend of the show. This is kind of for both of us. What is your processes for improvising characters like Mangata or Aslan Rex? Characters who know so much but reveal so little, but especially the complication of characters that experience reality differently from living mortal people. Let me give you one aside. When you switch into Aslan is my favorite thing in the whole world, because you can see like your physicality changes. It's like, oh, Aslan is here now. And y'all, when you watch Black Dice Society, when I call upon him to do Aslan, he never knows that's going to happen. So when I'm just like, hey, what does Aslan think about this? And then he does it, that is always off the dome right there. Like if he's not wearing the mask, he did not know I was going to ask for that. So first of all, brava. But, I guess for you almost have 2 layers, because yes, I don't think it's a surprise. You and I talk behind the scenes of, what's Aslan doing? What's Aslan thinking? So you kind of have an idea of his trajectory relative to the story, but you don't know what I'm doing moment to moment. You don't know what Strahd's doing. You don't know what the other Dark Lords are doing. So you almost got two levels of what Aslan knows that the group doesn't, and what Aslan doesn't know. So, how do you manage that?
Just going into it by knowing what Aslan's perspective is and like playing him as like, okay, well, he knows this, and thus he will act accordingly based on what I know of his personality. And again, I've been a fan of Darkon and Aslan for a long time, so yeah, I pretty much know what he's about. Very lawful evil, let me tell you that.
It's I think you hit on something important though, that it really does just come down to knowing what your character would do. Because people ask me that all the time about like Victor, in LA by Night. They're like, how'd you think of that so quickly? Like, how'd you come up with what he said? I'm like, because I know him. So, I mean, quite frankly, I know him because I am him. Like, I think of all my characters, he's the closest to me as a person. So the switch between stimulus and response is more or less instantaneous, where it's like, here's the thing, here's his reaction. Here's the thing, here's his reaction. I don't have to ask myself extensively, like, would he go left or right? It's because I know him. It's easy to to just choose. For Mangata, and you all, Mangata's a character I just introduced recently into the Black Dice Society, who is a Moonstone Dragon. And Moonstone dragons are part dragon, part fae. They're dragons that are born in the Feywild, basically. They're in Fizban's Treasury of Dragons, which hasn't come out yet, but you'll see them soon. And they experience time non-linearly. So I introduced a character who presumably knows all these things from the future, but doesn't comprehend that the future is not now for you. And it is a challenge in the sense that, again, I, as a storyteller, have my plans of roughly where the narrative is headed. But, both the dice and the characters can surprise and betray you. And so it's difficult to envision too far out because we don't necessarily know what's going to happen. A couple of bad dice rolls from you and a couple of good dice rolls from me could, eradicate anybody. And so, and we run into this a lot because I think people don't know two things. We pre-tape our epilogues pretty far out. And the farther out they get, the harder it becomes to know, where we'll be or what we'll be doing. So we have to get like increasingly vague in the epilogues.
I will say this. I really wish I'd known about Tiny Aslan Rex when recorded the epilogue that went with that episode, because he would have mentioned it.
Tiny Aslan Rex was great. You know what else? Yeah. For people who watch the show, or if you haven't, when you start watching, I believe the first 6 episodes have Aslan, Rex, and Strahd talking at the end of them. And we shot all of that before episode 1 of the show. And so it's a mixed blessing in the sense that I have to pace it in such a way that that epilogue is going to make sense. But it also kind of gives me a signpost that I'm like, well, I need to be roughly here, or what's going to happen afterwards won't make any sense. But it's surprising how often it just syncs up perfectly, just based on just the way the story falls.
Yeah, like a Taroka card reading, for example, which all the ones that Nora have done, and she's just doing those. She's pulling them at random, and then B Dave looks at the meaning and is like, oh wow, that's really applied.
She's not faking it because she can't fake it, because there's things she doesn't know how right it is. Like her Taroka deck pulls have just been out of this world, like just batting 1,000 every time. And I don't mean like, a symbolic reach. I'm like, no, that is eerily specific every time. Here's another one. This is from Mad King Henry. Mark, do you find the voice and then make the character, or make the character and then find the voice? Which I wanted to ask you about this, because both Chaz Price and King Aslan Rex are so delightfully foul. In especially for you to be such a genuinely sweetheart of a person and then just play just the worst characters.
Like bad guys. I've always liked super villains and Darth Vader, and those are always my favorites.
So yeah, in your process of discovering these characters, like for Chaz, I know some of the things you were given, but you had to bring him to life. And the same thing with Aslan. Some of the things you were given, but you had to bring them to life. So what is your process for that?
Well, again, in both of those cases, Jason Carl, for example, had already created Chaz and like gave him to me, and so I was able to look at the character and then come up with a voice. Obviously, it's like British. He's probably, even if he didn't start with a posh accent, I think he would definitely refine one. Essentially, let's see. I mean, Aslan, again, an established character from lore, so I went in knowing a lot about him before I had to embody him vocally. In general, though, like say Brother Uriah, let's talk about the creation process behind him. Now, his creation started in the same way that I think my very first D&D game went, which was the DM said, we need a cleric. And so I was like, all right, so I'm going to roll up a cleric. I created him. I started thinking about what I wanted to bring to the party. I kind of had a vague idea of at least like the classes that people were playing, and in some cases even what their personality types would be like. And so I decided that I wanted to pay homage to the old Disney Ichabod Crane cartoon. And like that's who Uriah would be. And obviously, if you've seen pictures of him with the tricorn hat and the long coat and whatnot,
I mean, he's right behind you if they haven't seen. There he is. Yep, that's him.
So knowing that, I decided what kind of character type I wanted to do, what his personality would be like, and then from there, it's like okay, and then experimented a little bit, talking to myself in a room about what his voice would sound like. But knowing those aspects of his personality, the voice, it jumped out at me fairly quickly. I didn't do too much experimentation.
You know what's funny for me? Probably 9 times out of 10, for the most part, I find out the character's voice when I open my mouth and say something. Like I may or may not have a plan, but I just start talking and I'm like, so this is them now. Here's where I think the most work I put into a character was Marseille the Typhoon for Dimension 20. That was the most previous thought I had. I think the most surprised I've been was Iris for Idle Champions Presents, which you and I are about to do ICP 3 soon.
Oh, yes.
I mean, are we ICP 2? We're 2. I don't know. We did 2 stories, but it was 1 ICP.
I loved having Iris sound like, Harvey Firestein, and it immediately endeared Iris to me. I was playing Baloth, of course, Chaotic Evil Drow, but it says like, oh, Iris, I love Iris.
So let me tell you all the story behind Iris. So Iris, you won't be, I don't think you're going to be able to see this, but Iris she's a beholder. No, that's not going to show up. Kinda, I guess. No, never mind, it won't. For C&E Games, Idle Champion. She's the mascot for the game. She's a beholder. And we had talked in advance about the fact that there was an Iris familiar that was going to be available. So I wanted her to show up in the game. In my thought process, what was going through my head, like in real time, while you and Havilar and everybody are all talking there, I was like, I need to introduce this beholder, but I need to introduce her in such a way that you will know she is not your enemy. Because under different circumstances, I'm like, beholder rolls around the corner. It's like, roll initiative. Like, here we go. It's time for this beholder. So instead of just describing her, then I'm just like, oh, hello, darling. Baloth, it's good to see you again. And I'm inside. I was like, this is their corporate logo. This is their mascot. Oh, no. What if I've ruined it? Luckily enough, they all loved Iris. So,
oh, yeah. And it fits so well. Like, just even with the name, that's sort of like, oh, yeah, I can see.
My name is Iris. Yes. Yeah.
Hello, Iris. Good to see you.
Yep. Hey, maybe we'll get to see more of Iris in this upcoming adventure. Who can say? Ooh, we got a bunch of questions.
Actually, I have an actual question for you, B-Dave.
Ooh.
So we are playing, I believe, I hope I'm not letting any cats out of any bags, but we are playing a sort of epic level campaign.
Yes.
I certainly described it like that in tweets already, so I think it's clear to say. Yeah.
Yes. You all will be fighting to preserve the fate of the Forgotten Realms, by the way. There is a full-scale invasion that you all are working to prevent, and success is not guaranteed. And one of the things I said in the Session 0 was, when you face the Mother of Dragons, when you face Tiamat, I am going to hit you guys as hard as I possibly can. And she's going to drop some people like she will.
Yeah, probably.
So yeah. So it's yeah, it's gonna be a good time. It's gonna be a good time. It's we've been working on this one for a while. It is going to be two parties working in tandem. Both of you have certain missions that you have to achieve to give yourself an advantage in the final battle. If you don't do it, you won't have that advantage. And you know, the Mother of Dragons knows you're coming, and she's gonna be there waiting for you. And I'm really looking forward to that. Really looking forward to that.
I'm really glad that the concept of variance has been introduced into popular culture, because I enjoy playing Baloth, and you know, well, if things don't go my way, I think Baloth from Earth Beta is going to have to show up.
or
Keeping that in my pocket.
Hear me out. Canonically, and this is true, Baloth has a Tarask in the Black Pits because I gave it to him in our game at D&D Live. So maybe Baloth can end up with Tiamat in the Black Pits. There's time, Baloth.
That's the dream. That's the dream.
Imagine how many tickets you sell to that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And if we could get like a group of, I don't know, like say 6 kids to fight her, we'll give them some magic items. That'll be fun. It'll be a good night.
Set up the minecart ride that just goes into the dragon's mouth, and immediately on the other side, boom, Tiamat. There it is.
I like it.
We got a bunch of questions. Thank you all. Keep them coming, by the way. So I'm gonna.
Sorry, I didn't actually get to my actual question.
The actual question, yes.
What level are we going to be, Dave? Because I've got several versions of Baloth.
You will be starting at 17, and you will be ending at 20. So we will see the full divine capability of Baloth the Entertainer. Maximum Baloth.
Very well. Very well. Okay, I look forward to that. Now, let's get to the next questions.
Yeah, we'll just go down the list here. This is from Wex Verdi. How do you handle important plot reveals if the characters are not quite getting it and are effectively stuck? I would like to speak to this because this comes up a lot. I watched some content over the weekend where people were kind of trapped spinning their wheels unnecessarily, which is always bothersome to me. It's a delicate balancing act between just giving them everything and like letting them work at it. But I find back in the before times, I would do a lot of escape rooms, and my friends and I would just descend on these things like a swarm of bees and just go through and one of the things you learn quickly, if when you encounter a puzzle, if you don't figure it out in about 3 minutes, you're not gonna. Like your mind will just lock up on what you think it is and just stop seeing it. And we just swap to a new thing. So after about 3 to 5 minutes, I will either give a roll to see if you realize something, remember something, kind of, you know, prod them with a little hint, or have some other helper come along. Because it's frustrating when you just can't do anything. I just about a month ago, I played in a scenario, which I will remain vague because it was on screen. And we just were trapped spinning our wheels for about an hour, and it was just awful, you know, and then afterwards it's like, oh, this is what it was. And it's like, not only did we not know that, we never would have guessed that ever, you know, like something should have come along to tell us. So, yeah, I'd say a dice roll for a hint is usually how I handle it. How do you handle it?
No, that's an excellent way to do it, especially in 5th edition, because it's a mechanic that's basically built in. And of course, again, you're doing collective storytelling, so you don't want there to be long periods of dead space in your story. You want to move things along. You want to help the narrative. So yeah, I am in full agreement with doing that.
Yeah, and you got to realize that, you know, some people are puzzle people and other people are not puzzle people, and it's just not the way their brains work, or will miss clues or miss a thread or something like that that you can very easily ignite by being like, everybody give me a perception check. Oh, the green rock is particularly shiny. You know what I mean? Like sometimes that's enough to like get their juices flowing again. Will the Star Chaser 43, will Mr. Meer DM any additional episodes of Black Dice Society? I enjoyed his style in the last episode, and he did, and hoping for more. I don't know, Mr. Meer. Are you going to be DMing anymore?
I couldn't possibly say at this point. I don't know if it's for me to say, but perhaps someone in authority could answer that question.
IDK, although I'd say the odds are good.
Oh, cool.
For another from Art and Audio, is there a horror TTRPG system that you've never played before, but you would love to have the opportunity to play?
Hmm. Let's see. I've never actually played GURPS Horror, and
Hmm.
I owned the book,
Hmm.
and I really like the old GURPS system, like back in the
Steve
early
Jackson.
night.
Shout out to our
Yeah.
homie.
Hmm. And it was a great book too, and just like some of the concepts it introduced, and especially the GURPS mechanics. I would love to play around with that. I do like to occasionally go back and play classic um, classic games. And actually, along the same lines, there's a module that I wrote for the
Ooh.
old Marvel role playing game system, and it was a horror game with like Dracula and Werewolf by Night and
What was it,
monster.
Mobius?
So, oh, Morbius, yes,
Yeah,
I think
Morbius.
he was in there, and it was all the greatest hits of the Marvel Halloweeny heroes and villains. So yeah, I would like a chance to actually play that campaign.
This is relevant to my interests. I think the new Aliens game by Free League, I've yet to get to play. I think, and I've heard good things. I think that'd be it for me. Catastrophic 912. How to deal with PCs and trauma. Example, playing a Call of Cthulhu and PC saying horrible things, but totally just chill about it. Does it take away from the story or does it help move it along? This is difficult. Um, because I'll share something that happened with us in our Nightmare Lands Patreon bonus episode for the Black Dice Society, which all of our patrons on patreon.com/the Black Dice Society get access to the full-length episode. I kind of ran into that because when you're like, well, you're in the plane of nightmares, and it's like, oh, it's just a dream, then it doesn't matter. And I'm like, yeah, but anybody who's had a bad dream knows that is not the case. you know? So that was part of the reason why I started twisting the knife as much as I did, that I was like, oh, well, okay. Now it's got to be worse, you know? But I also think it's hard to gauge what isn't really affecting someone just because they seem like it isn't. Because sometimes that's a defense mechanism, you know? The fact that they may just seem very blank might be they're the most afraid, you know? So I personally, I think all you can do is try and lay it out and don't, because the more you're like, is it scary yet? Oh, is it scary yet? Oh, am I bothering you yet? You're getting further away from what it's supposed to be. I mean, what do you
Mhm.
think?
I mean, as a player, I always like to dig into that, and if my Call of Cthulhu character, for example, loses sanity, I have them have it affect them to the core of their being, like their very perception of reality has shifted under their feet, and it takes them a little while to process that. So I would encourage, like as a DM or a GM, I would encourage my players to role play that. If I'm feeling that I'm pushing too far, then obviously you're going to back off. And of course, as B Dave mentioned, discussing say lines and veils
Mm-hmm.
with your players ahead of time is extremely important,
Mm-hmm.
especially in a horror game.
Mm-hmm. I mean, consent is always sexy, and it is especially important in something like this, because you don't know what people's hot buttons are. Sometimes they don't know until you trip over it, you know, and then they find themselves unable to even. I think it's just the thing to remember for players, in as a player, and to express to your players, is these things are real to them, you know, in try and act from the place that this is real to them, right? But it comes and goes with the territory. Oh, Cypher a Tier. Shout out to our homie. Also on Black Dice Society. That's her right over your shoulder there. There's a wild fin.
Wait,
Other way there. Nope, there she is. There's a wild fin. How do you deal with players that try to be that's what she said in games where that's not the established tone? I've run into this. I personally have two things. I've had situations where I had to pull someone aside, literally, and be like, "Hey, stop that! Stop that." To this person's credit, they were nervous and they were scared, and this is how that human truly deals with that. That they're the one when things are rough, they crack a joke to lighten the mood on purpose. And I'm like, but we don't want the mood lightened, you know? And I had to be like, so don't do that. I think the simplest thing I will do, and you'll see me do this sometimes in streams or in games, is if somebody's getting out of hand, I just give them this one. I just look right at them and I'm like, usually that's enough. Usually that's enough. Yeah. What about you?
I mean, before, obviously, if taking someone aside and just having a brief word is necessary, yes, you should definitely do that. Before, I'd say my first instinct would be to have an NPC address it, and maybe a powerful NPC, and not that I'm going to just like, you take 5,000 points of damage,
Yeah.
but perhaps a warning word from someone vaguely threatening within the game that they know outclasses them. That might ease them into perhaps not joking so much.
I will throw a curveball also. There might be a time that you intend to do a scary story, and if everybody just has the giggles and the whole table has decided that today's not the scary day,
then that's what the day is. Because,
Yeah.
again, you're working with the table. I'm talking about a situation where one person is sort of like derailing the experience for the rest of the party, and then it's like, no, you can have your fun, but that's not fair to everybody else.
Agreed. That's the one person who is the disruptor gets corrected. If it just so happens the group has the giggles, then, maybe just this one session of Vampire is what we do in the shadows inspired,
Yeah, it's sort of like, oh, this is what we're doing today. Okay,
yeah, right. Here we are. But I will say though, I approach the situation in the sense that that person is operating in good faith. That this is their actual reaction to tension is that, and not they're trying to be a jerk, because that gets a different response. Good faith. How would Brother Uriah deal with having to potentially fight Tiamat? Thank you, Cassius335. I don't know that that'll ever come up, but how would Brother Uriah deal with the Mother of Dragons?
I mean, I've been told directly that Baloth is going to be facing Tiamat. So, and he's 17th level and up to 20. So, they'll certainly react in different ways. One is chaotic evil and one is lawful good. I mean, Brother Uriah at this point, again, coming from Ravenloft, he's seen one dragon in his life. About a couple of weeks ago, he first saw a dragon and thought up to this point that they were creatures of myth. There were rumors that Aslan had a shadow dragon, that sort of thing. But again, he's never laid eyes on a dragon until a couple of weeks ago. So I don't know that he might just think like, oh, well, most dragons have 5 heads and are gargantuan and live in hell.
Apparently this is how that goes, right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And also, again, a dragon is a big scary monster, but in some ways, the soul devouring and horrific creatures of Ravenloft are more creepy than just the sheer unbridled monstrosity and fury of Tiamat. So he might just go, it's like a whirlwind.
It does seem like there's just a rife opportunity for a dread domain with a Dracolich Dark Lord.
Yeah, you would think so.
You would think. You guys can take that idea. It's on the house, because it may or may not show up in our game eventually. But they do seem like prime candidates, especially like a failed Dracolich that maybe didn't make it through the process but thinks it did. And then,
that'd be a good Dark Lord.
Yeah, because to your previous point, the dread domains are prisons, but they're luxury prisons. They create the illusion of giving you exactly what you wanted, but no, though.
Yeah, you always get Twilight Zoned.
Yep.
Like
the monkey paw. Yep. Magus Union, what's both your views on power scaling in TTRPGs, whether be it with or without homebrew content in games? I'll let you answer that one first.
Power scaling in terms of, once a book has been out for a while, it just gets out of hand as like homebrew things get added, or
probably. I mean, you know what I know.
Okay. I do think that it's important to keep everybody on the same plane in a party. So, for example, if you're going to allow one of your party members to homebrew a feat or something like that, you have to let everybody have that, and maybe even assign. If you've given somebody something that seems a little OP, you can either scale it back, but that always feels like clawing something back. So, like, give something to the rest of the party, and then also beef up the foes accordingly. It's like, oh,
Yep,
all the players have these great homebrew abilities. So does Tiamat now. So
exactly.
does yeah.
Yep. I generally don't make use of homebrew stuff because for the most part, the rules exist the way they exist for a reason, and things get out of hand very quickly with the law of unintended consequences.
Yeah, can
Uh,
it be a bit of a house of cards where it's
yeah,
just like, oh, but that means that this spell does this now, and like, yeah, so
especially because I came up during 3.0 and 3.5 time, and that's what did those games in. That there's so many books came out that here's the book that says you have +5 to attack on Tuesday, and here's the book that says you have +10 to damage when you're wearing red, and here's the book that says if you have long hair, you get to roll 3 times and take the highest one. And then monsters like me would come along and are like, so what you're telling me is at noon on Tuesday, I have a guaranteed crit and do an extra 40d6 in damage. You know what I mean? And then it all fell apart very quickly. Also, I came up with Rifts, which is the worst power creep game ever. That every book is literally 3 times stronger than the book before it. So,
I remember Rifts, yeah.
yeah, it's difficult to do. All right, we're going to speed through these last few here to make sure we get through them all. Another one from Wex Verdi. How do you handle pacing? That's ironic that I'm like, we're going to speed through this. He's like, how do you handle pacing? How do you handle pacing when you know you want to hit a certain plot point? If you have to scrap something, do you save it for later or is that moment gone? I tell you again, when I do these things, I very carefully plan out the beginning. I have an idea of roughly where I want to be by the break and roughly where I want to be by the end, but I don't plan the second half of any stream or adventure ever, to give myself that room to move around and give the crew the time to do the thing that they are going to want to do. For the most part, I will condense or expand as necessary to hit the point that I want to hit, especially if it's going to be a cliffhanger. What about you?
I do have a very improvisational style, especially in regards to like the ending of adventures or what happens. So yeah, I'm usually able to just go with the flow and see what's happened, and then if again, I usually don't DM streaming games. I'm DMing like home games. So if I know that we want to take a break around then, I can introduce an element or at least something to give a little, here's a little capstone to this part of the adventure.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I usually do that on an improvisational basis.
I mean, it is the best way. Stabigail the Kobold, another friend of the show. Always love that name, Stabigail.
That's a good name.
How do you deal with potentially problematic players who seem to want to try and drive the plot off the rails and become the BBEG themselves? I really want to include this person, but they can be a bit difficult.
Well, your specific thing, if somebody wants to become the evil person, like, or like accumulate power, betray the rest of the party.
Yeah, I think to the detriment of the group. Yeah.
Right. With them, I might actually, break it can be a little awkward sometimes, but I will okay, I'm going to take you into a room and we're going to role play a little bit here. I might invent like a whole bunch of other NPCs for them to hang out with. And again, I don't want to take too much time away from the rest of the group, but they also have to know that, yeah, you got to go off in the room and have your own little side adventure. But when I go back to the rest of the group, you're not there. You're cooling your heels. So they might get the idea that, oh, maybe hanging out with the rest of the group would be good. So I'm not spending long stretches just hanging around.
Yeah. And unfortunately, not every table is for every player also, which is something that you have to keep in mind. I think it's important to lay out at the beginning, and this is one of the values of session 0, of what is the game we are here to play. Everybody needs a time to shine every adventure. Like the sneak needs to have a chance to sneak, the skill monkey needs to have a chance to skill monkey, the face needs to have a chance to talk, the barbarian needs to have a chance to hit something. But for the most part, you want to make sure that everybody is always rowing in the same direction, though. That this is a horror game, or an adventure game, or a comedic game, even though, hopefully all of your sessions can have elements of all of those things. But I think you just really need to nail down at first what's the game you're playing. I know this comes up a lot in Vampire, where inevitably you have the one trench coat katana guy, who is just looking to go out and fight. But then if somebody else is only looking for courtly intrigue, burdened by ennui, drinking blood in the Elysium, one of them is going to be always dissatisfied. So you kind of need to make sure that everybody has signed up for the same thing. But quite frankly, if you know in advance that a certain person is difficult, you don't have to have them play, and that doesn't make them a bad person. It just makes them not a fit for the story you're telling right then, One last question from Cassius335. Cassius, I'm not going to answer that one. You'll just have to see. Before we start wrapping this up, if you haven't signed up for your free account on Demiplanar yet, maybe you should check it out. Free to sign up. You can play some games with your friends, maybe find some new friends to play with. Obviously, I'm a fan, so there you go. Super dope, and we'd appreciate it. Mark, where can these beautiful people find you?
Well, of course, I am on Instagram at Mr. Mark Meer. That's Mark Meer. I'm on Twitter at Mark_Meer because I do not have unified social media. I, of course, can be seen every Thursday on the Black Dice Society, on the official Dungeons and Dragons YouTube and Twitch channels. You can hear me in the Mass Effect Legendary Edition. The trilogy was just re-released earlier this year. Oh, and I should mention that The Long Dark has a new episode out. This is the survival post-apocalyptic game with myself and Jennifer Hale and Elias Tufexis, who you may remember as Adam Jensen, as well as from his appearances on The Expanse. He is our new villain, which is introduced in episode 4. And that's available on pretty much every platform.
You got a vampire podcast too, right?
Oh, yes. And before I forget, lest I forget, Stitch of Fate, a podcast by night. We're actually going to be doing a very special episode, recording that very soon with a special guest. It's a one-shot with my Nosferatu, Max, and Mr. Lucky Yates, who plays Krieger on Archer. So Lucky, old friend of mine, and we're going to play a little Vampire the Masquerade. It'll. Speaking of humorous departures from a horror narrative, that's what this will be. That is definitely what this will be.
That's what we're doing. Fantastic. Y'all already know me. You know where to find me. I'm somewhere doing something 7 days a week, but definitely tomorrow night, Tuesday, 6 p.m., Heroes of the Plains. We are going to be facing off against Asmodeus. I'm sure it's going to be fine. Can't imagine why we can't just talk or smite our way out of a situation with the Lord of Hell, because there's a demonic invasion that is affecting all the planes simultaneously. It's all right. We're going to sort it out. Just follow me on the Instagrams and on Twitter and all the other socials at @BDaveWalters to figure out where I am and what I'm doing. Again, sign up for Demiplanar. It is free. Black Dice Society, Thursday at 4, where you get to see the wonderful Mr. Mark Meer, not just as the comedically improbable hero, Brother Uriah, but the arch-lich Azalin Rex. And now, since it wouldn't be me if I didn't ambush you, what would Azalin Rex say to these fine people to sign them off for the day?
I should go. There you go. That was a Black Dice reference and a Mass Effect reference.
There you go. There you go. I cannot possibly top that. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next week. We're going to have Mr. Jason Carl here to talk more about spooky storytelling, vampire, and everything else. So get your questions ready for him as well. And we will see you all next week. Bye-bye.